Hi, good afternoon. This is, or evening, or whenever you happen to be watching. This is Sandy Shallis with Environmental Coffee House. Today we have a really special show. We have the esteemed Professor Peter Wadhams, and of course, my partner Jennifer Hines. And I'm going to give this to Jennifer to introduce Peter properly.
Well, we are just so thrilled to have Peter with us today. Peter is Professor Emeritus of Cambridge University, the former head of the Polar Ocean Physics Department, and has gone to the Arctic over the last 50 years, having gone on over 50 field journeys. Nobody knows the Arctic better than Peter. So with that, Peter, we're so happy to welcome you to Environmental Coffee House.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Wow, wonderful.
Yeah, well, what spurred this was the discussion on scientists' warning, the new scientists' warning, with Allison Green, Dr. Allison Green, and the three young people that wrote the critique. And we have some information, and we want you to be able to share your thoughts and feelings, Peter, about this. And I'll give a quote: "The faulty science, doomism, and flawed conclusions of deep adaptation," but not specifically, but more about your own research and what your feelings are towards being summarily dragged out in front of, the science community and
pummeled, I would say. Pummeled. Yes, pummeled would be a good one. And guys, we want to give Peter this opportunity to have a platform to respond honestly about what was dug up in that article that Sandy just alluded to, and also to the two YouTube videos by Allison Green and the two young guys, the faulty science of deep adaptation. So with that, Peter, we're so happy to have you here. What do you think of all of this?
Well, I was very surprised. I mean, I don't mind at all having my work analysed critically by other scientists who know something about science, but to be insulted by little kids who have absolutely no knowledge whatever about the Arctic is pretty annoying, because they're using that simply as a way of getting at Bendell, because they don't approve of his philosophy. And they are presumably saying his philosophy about climate change is that we're all going to hell in a handcart, and there's not much we can do. All we can do is adapt to it. Now, I don't agree with that view, because I think we have to do absolutely everything we can to try to protect ourselves from climate change. But at the same time, the science that he describes and ascribes to me is accurate. So he's giving an accurate account of what science is telling us about the rate of climate change being more rapid than people thought it was, even though you don't necessarily have to agree with him that we should all give up and start to mentally adapt. So these kids who know nothing took it upon themselves to insult my entire lifetime of scientific work because of a political aim of their own. And that sort of arrogance. It's arrogance as well as ignorance. That sort of arrogance and ignorance doesn't stand them in a good way if they want to be scientists in the future, because they're not scientists now, and at this rate they will never become scientists. They're just nauseating kids. And so if we look at a few of the things they've said, they are defamatory as well as being stupid. So first of all, they don't know anything about climate tipping or climate change. So they got somebody called Dr. David Armstrong Mackay, who I've never heard of, to explain everything to them, because he's a postdoctoral researcher, which means he's a couple of levels beyond theirs. And he says that the warming expected from the ice-free summers is about 0.5 degrees globally, which is actually much less than the predictions of people who actually study the ice. Then the next thing they say is that that Wadhams believes an ice-free Arctic will occur one summer in the next few years, which I do, and it will likely increase by 50% the warming caused by the CO2 produced by human activity. Now, that's in a Nature paper, and it's based on the fact that when you take away the ice from the Arctic, you increase you decrease the albedo of the surface of the planet. That is, you make it darker, and you darken it in two ways. One is by taking away the sea ice. The other one is by taking away snow. That the snow line is retreating as well because of global warming. If you put those two together, it's equivalent to adding 50% to the warming caused by the CO2 emitted by human beings. That's a very serious acceleration, and it's recognized as such, and it's recognized as a really serious effect. Now, they then say, this passage shows the author's tendency to dismiss the work of hundreds of scientists based on one person's estimate. So they're saying that by saying this, which is published, I'm dismissing the work of hundreds of scientists who have said that this is not happening, which is completely untrue. I mean, there are no hundreds of scientists ganging up to say nothing much is happening. This is complete fantasy dreamed up by these students. And then it's even a cursory search reveals that the magnitude of Wadham's prediction is off, and so is his timeline. Well, they haven't even done a cursory search, because if they had have done, they would have seen that this is absolutely in line with what we know about how albedo changes when ice disappears. And the next thing he claims is that I was predicting ice-free summers that were condemned by multiple scientists. See, they don't give the names of any of these multiple scientists. That multiple scientists I've talked to say this is untrue. Name one of these scientists. They don't. They don't know any scientists. So they claim multiple scientists have said that it's low credibility that there will be an ice-free summer shortly. Well, if they looked out of the window, they would see that this summer is likely to become an ice-free summer. That the ice level, the quantity of ice in the Arctic this summer is lower than ever before, and hundreds of scientists predict that there's a distinct possibility that in September we will have no ice. And if we don't have it this September, we'll have it next September. Now, if I predicted this would happen by 2018, I'm only a couple of years off, whereas the scientists that they go along with say that there will be ice until 2050, which is complete rubbish. So they're arguing from the basis of personal ignorance and malice at the same time, which I find distinctly revolting, and the way that you wouldn't want a new scientist to start off with that kind of arrogance, because he's wrong. They're wrong. So they're saying ice-free summers won't happen as soon as it's claimed, and ice-free summers won't cause nearly as much warming as it's claimed. Both of those statements are wrong. And they go on to say other climate scientists have repeatedly cautioned against trusting Wadhams's predictions. Again, which climate scientists? And there's a kind of arrogance there that I would find absolutely revolting. And they go on to say that claims, not made by myself entirely, but a lot of other people as well, that methane levels will increase rapidly because of the dissociation of marine clathrates. That's the methane in the seabed of the Arctic. That won't happen either. But there's enormous fear that it will, and that we must be making preparations for the possibility of a huge methane outbreak from the Arctic seabed, because the Arctic Ocean water is warming up very rapidly in summer because there's no ice there, and this is contributing to the possibility of releasing methane from the seabed. So they go on, and they simply can't say anything that isn't nasty. And I think the last nasty defamatory statement is some of Bendell's own sources. I'm not a source for Bendell, I just publish papers, like Wadhams, gained prominence in this way by making bold but weakly supported claims about, for example, Arctic ice sheet collapse. Now, the first thing is I've never made any claims about Arctic ice sheet collapse. What this indicates is these students don't know the difference between an ice sheet and sea ice. But this bold but weakly supported claims indicates that the people doing that are trying to get publicity for themselves by making claims about a rapid effect that isn't happening. Now, that is defamatory, because any claims I make about what's going on are based on 50 years of field research, which is about 49 and a half years more than they've done, and it's based on scientific results. And I'm not seeking to gain prominence. I'm seeking to gain prominence, but according to this, but in fact I've just retired, so I'm not sure why I'm seeking to gain prominence in my career when my career is now over. And so the other thing I think about is a truly great scientist who died today, and that is Connie Stephan, a person I have enormous respect for. Yeah, he's an Arctic scientist who works on ice sheet. He works on ice sheets, and he's Swiss. He runs a lab at Davos, and he has a base in Greenland, and he died in an accident at that base. Now, the thing about Stephan is he's one of the greatest Arctic scientists there are, and he's been making bold but weakly supported claims, except that they're strongly supported. And he's been claiming that sea level rise is going to be more rapid than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, because the Arctic ice sheet is melting much more rapidly. And he's even has been saying that although the official figure that IPCC puts out is that global sea level will rise less than a metre this century, his personal view is it will be much more than that, possibly up to 4 metres. Now, that's very, very serious, because it affects every coastal city. 79 million people live within 2 metres of the sea level. So the future of mankind is very strongly dependent on how fast sea level rises. And his view, based on a lifetime of research, is that sea level is rising much faster than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says. Now, sadly, he won't be able to make that case anymore. But in making it, he based it on a lifetime of really solid research. No one would dare to say that he was trying to gain prominence by making bold but weakly supported claims. So they need to apologise to people like him, as well as to people like me, in 2 YouTube interviews that weren't really interviews at all, but were simply saying, oh yes, you're wonderful, everything you say is right. I think that's completely wrong, and I find it odious and repulsive.
You know, one thing I noticed is that they were saying the science and the math was wrong. Deeply and disastrously wrong. They took exception to the exponentiation, right? And they took exception to the polynomial trend lines, which you can see if you look at any graph, they're all on a polynomial trend line. However, they said the exponentiation simply isn't there, and that makes you guys alarmists. How do you respond to that?
Well, in that case, everybody who saw the beginning of the COVID epidemic would have been accused of being alarmist if they were saying, look at the doubling time for the number of cases. This is an exponential growth. We better do something very, very serious very quickly, or we're going to get a massive number of cases. People who took that to heart and actually produced a close down very quickly are the countries that haven't had disastrous outbreaks. Countries that didn't do that because they said, oh, we don't have to worry about it. It's not really an exponential. It's going to die away naturally, so we won't do anything, like Trump, have caused hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. So we see the exponential is the way in which many, many processes in nature happen, one of them being the spread of a virus. And if you don't take account of that, then you're in dire trouble, as the human race is now.
Absolutely. And any graph that you look at that plots any gas, any trend, population, oil, anything pretty much having to do with our civilization or the climate, I've noticed, like, for example, looking at a CO2 increase graph, you know, that goes back several thousand years, you can see it's just boom, and it goes straight up, and we're right off a cliff. And it's just the only reason that the climate hasn't caught up with it yet is that there's a delay, and it is going to catch up with it, and it is going to get hotter. It is, quote, already baked in. So I think that their denial of exponentiation is curious, right, to say the least.
Well, it's curious given that the curve of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is increasing exponentially. That is increasing faster than exponentially. And the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere is the fundamental indicator of how much global warming we're getting or going to get. And that's despite everything we've said about the Paris Agreement and reducing our emissions. We are, in fact, increasing our emissions exponentially. We're getting an exponential growth in CO2 in the atmosphere. That's producing an exponential growth in global warming. So the basic indicator of climate change is itself an exponentially growing function. So I don't see how they can deny exponentiality in other aspects of the climate when the fundamental aspect is an exponential change.
There has been a lot of talk lately about having free ice, ice-free at the North Pole. And you know, the North Pole is not where the thickest ice is in the Arctic. And there has been a lot, I mean, there's been the Arctic hurricane that we had at the end of July that ripped up all the sea and chopped it up into little broken pieces all the way from the Beaufort Sea across the Arctic. That happened at the end. And I think there's possibly another hurricane forming now, but I'm not quite sure on that. But what is happening these days is that we're able to see that the sea ice volume and the sea ice thickness right around the North Pole is getting extremely thin. Could you address that for us?
Yes, because the ice extent and the ice thickness are both going down, but the parts of the Arctic that are where the ice is likely to last longest are the areas which have multi-year ice. That's ice that's more than 1 year old. And there's the amount of multi-year ice in the Arctic, it used to be the dominant ice type in the Arctic, but now there's scarcely any left. And the places where you still get it are a fringe of ice along the north coast of Ellesmere Island and Greenland. That's along the edge of the Arctic Ocean, while the central Arctic Ocean is all first-year ice, and this first-year ice is much thinner, and it's getting thinner still. So when we look at the next stages in the disintegration and the disappearance of Arctic sea ice, what's going to happen? It's the ice around the North Pole that's going to go. That's the next ice to go, is the ice going from the Beaufort Sea up to the North Pole. And the ice that will remain, and maybe for another year or 2 or 3, is the multi-year ice along the coast of Ellesmere Island and Greenland. So I would expect that the next stage in the loss of ice would be an ice-free sea, really, an ice-free channel, at least, an ice-free sea, going from the coastal parts of the Arctic in north of Alaska, the Beaufort Sea, right up to the North Pole. And this hasn't happened before. We haven't had a large area of open water at the North Pole. We've had polynias, but they haven't lasted long. So this will be the next stage. And I think it will be interesting because most people who don't know about ice sort of think, well, if the North Pole is ice-free, that's it. The ice has gone from the Arctic. This will be what the popular press will say, ice is gone from the North Pole. I mean, I'd be more cautious and say we shouldn't say that the Arctic is ice-free until the area of ice that remains in the summer is right down to some figure of less than 1 million square kilometers. So it's quite possible that a lot of ice will go, there'll be less ice than ever before, but what remains, which is the old ice around the coast of Ellesmere Island, will be more than 1 million square kilometers. So we can't officially talk about an ice-free Arctic this year, but unofficially, and the way that the press would represent it, is it's ice-free because you can sail all the way up to the North Pole without seeing any ice. And that may well be what will happen. We'll have an ice-free Arctic going up to the North Pole. And so a lot of people, with some justification, will say, well, that means the ice has gone, doesn't it? Even though there's still some left around the edges.
Mm-hmm. Another very controversial thing is, of course, the methane monster. And it's controversial because it really matters. There's a huge amount of methane in the East Siberian Sea, the East Siberian Arctic Shelf. All that is basically frozen currently and submerged permafrost since the last ice age. And it really matters how quickly and how forcefully the methane comes out, because as you and I both know, methane will not persist in the atmosphere as methane, CH4, for more than, couple dozen years. But during that couple dozen years, it's fierce, it's hot, it's instantaneous. So it matters how quickly this methane comes out in the methane deposits in the East Siberian Arctic Shelf. And will there be enough methane coming out to cause a quick pop of, say, 0.5 degree centigrade or not? And that is the question.
Well, it's a good question and very important one. In fact, I'm writing a proposal at the moment with colleagues from the Climate Restoration Foundation to try to get some substantial support for a kind of prophylactic be prepared to get rid of a huge amount of methane project, because this problem is likely to erupt and could do so, and if it does, it's going to be disastrous. The thing is that there's a huge quantity of methane in the sediments under the Siberian Sea, and the estimates are by the Russian scientists who work there most, that there's about 700 gigatons waiting to come out. By waiting, it's waiting to come out because it's being held down by a layer of frozen permafrost, which dates back to the Ice Age. Now, this was all stable right up until about 10 years ago, because the water in the Arctic Ocean was still was still very cold in summer because there was still sea ice there, and therefore the water on the seabed wasn't much above zero, and so the seabed was bathed in freezing water and remained frozen. So you've got a stable situation whereby potentially unstable and dangerous methane hydrates are held down by the kind of pressure of like a pressure cooker of permafrost on the seabed. Now, what's altered in the last few years is that with sea ice retreating in summer and the water being very shallow, the water warms up, and I've measured it actually 11 degrees there in summer. And that 11-degree water, which you can swim in, is bathing the seabed now in the East Siberian Sea. And that permafrost on the seabed is thawing, and that's going to release this 700 gigatons of methane. And the Russian scientists who looked at this made very conservative predictions, saying, well, maybe only 80 gigatons will come out, or 50 gigatons will come out initially, and then take time for the rest of the methane to come out. But 50 gigatons, we worked out with them what that would mean, and it would mean 0.6 of a degree of warming almost immediately worldwide, and gigantic costs because of that. And that's probably a very conservative estimate, because they only counted in the East Siberian Sea, and we know that the Laptev Sea and the Kara Sea, that these are other Arctic seas that have maybe 4 times as much area as the East Siberian Sea, are also shallow water with large amounts of methane in the sediments. So we might get something far, far worse than the Russians have predicted. And yet that Russian prediction is itself for 0.6 of a degree of immediate global warming, which is huge in terms of what it would do to the world. So we really should be worried about the seabed of the Arctic Ocean and what could happen to it in a very few years. And therefore, I would strongly supporting, in fact, trying to work towards ways of getting, how do we get rid of this? How do we fight against a methane outbreak? There's a potential method that's being developed called iron salt aerosol, where you're blowing an aerosol with iron chloride over the surface, and that actually removes methane. Or there's another way, which is to marine cloud brightening, where you pump finely divided water particles into the bottoms of clouds. The clouds get brighter, and they reflect more energy, and that means that the seabed, or the seawater and the seabed, cool down, and the chance of a methane outbreak is reduced. These are all things we can try, and one of them, or more than one of them, is something we must try. So I feel if I feel religious about anything, it's we've got to find a way to save the world from a methane outburst, and be ready to go with some mitigating measures very quickly, because that outbreak could happen in a very few years' time, or could happen this year, because of the way in which the the permafrost on the seabed is disappearing.
Peter, my question on that would be, why would other scientists minimize the methane problem? And what does that gain when, and here you are, I don't feel like this is apocalyptic thinking. This is thinking that is forward and solution focused. So what would other scientists gain by minimizing an issue that needs to be addressed, as you say?
I have absolutely no idea. It's not as if we're dealing with some unknown phenomenon here. I mean, we're not talking about flying saucers or something. We're talking just about methane. The physics and the chemistry of methane are perfectly well known. The concentration of methane in the sediments is well known. The warming of the sediments due to climate change is well known. So the probability of this disaster happening is actually well known. You can assess it. You can do a risk analysis and come to some conclusion about what's the risk of a methane outbreak in the next few years. And most analyses come to pretty gloomy conclusions about that. So the scientists who say, this is alarmism, we mustn't bother with it, there's nothing happening, there's nothing going on, nothing to see here, just move on. I can't understand their mentality, because take the precautionary principle is one which is well known in climate science, that if something could be very nasty if it happens, and there's some chance that it will happen, we must take precautions. And yet the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change doesn't seem to want to take any about methane. And so there's a political thing there. I don't know why there is this downgrading of the threat from methane. I think it might be because nobody really has a good way of getting rid of methane yet. So instead of focusing on how do we do it, they would rather say, well, let's ignore it.
I have seen that, Peter. As you well know, about a year and a quarter ago, a very potent 6-minute video came out with Yale Climate Connections about the methane problem, and it showed a rather, I don't know if you recall it, I know that you made a response video to it about a year ago, kind of an emotional young girl who was upset about these conspiracy methane videos that had set her off and causing her psychological damage. And then she ran to the US Geological Survey to get, information. And this was kind of like, oh, now I realize that this was all a conspiracy and I really don't have anything to worry about. Do you recall this little
yes,
piece?
I remember that. Yeah, incredible. I think it was 2 people got that up. That was Ruppel and Schwartz. And they seem to have a vested interest in methane not coming out of the Arctic, because they've said there isn't any to come out. They sort of stake their reputation on methane not existing in the Arctic, which is a bit foolish since everybody who goes there sees huge amounts. It seems completely weird, given that there's no kind of psychological or psychic reason why we should pretend that methane is not a threat. It might be just the feeling that we're faced by so many threats, let's not add another one to them. Although, of course, it's there, we have to face up to it and deal with it. And I think a more balanced treatment of methane in the Arctic is given in this Leonardo DiCaprio film that came out last year called Ice on Fire. And in fact, the trailer, the poster advertising Ice on Fire shows a scientist or a man apparently on fire. And in fact, it's a scientist who was poking through a frozen lake in Siberia and released some methane which caught fire and sort of fired up around him. So and there's a lot of really good material about the actual methane threat and what we can do about it. And DiCaprio has really dealt, I think, very well in that film with things that IPCC doesn't want to touch, like the methane threat or the problem of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as opposed to trusting to emission reduction to take care of global warming. I mean, he's saying quite rightly, however much you reduce emissions, you'll still have some emissions. And if you have some emissions, you're going to have global warming because the CO2 level goes up. Therefore, the only real solution is to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we should be looking at air capture and other methods for capturing CO2, which DiCaprio goes on and deals with. So he deals with that, which it's become less of a sort of a banned subject now to talk about taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, because everybody realizes we have to do it. But it's still a banned subject to talk about taking precautionary measures about a methane outbreak. But DiCaprio does that to his credit. He really takes these subjects and deals with them in a very good way.
No, he's done fabulous work. I wanted to delve a little bit more into carbon sequestration, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, sequestering it and making faux limestone and using that for concrete roads, buildings, using it as an actual building material. Concrete is, of course, very carbon intensive. And if we could turn concrete into a carbon negative, what's the likelihood that this technology could be spun up at scale? And have you seen any receptivity among business people or the scientific community for getting something like that going?
I think we could. Not only do I think we could do it, but I think it's that sort of thing is the only hope that mankind has, because I don't see us reducing our emissions at the rate that's needed to even slow down global warming. The only way is to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, there's two approaches. I mean, one is the European approach, which is remove the CO2 out from the atmosphere. That's fairly easy. You just blow air over an absorber. You take out the CO2, but you have to do something with it. And the European approach will be to pump it underground or do something like that. And it will cost a lot of money. And you could expect people would have to pay for that out of taxes. And that there will be a global carbon tax, which would pay for air capture of carbon dioxide. That's the European approach. The US approach is, well, we don't do anything which involves taxation, because that's against God's will. So we use the CO2 to produce something else which we can make some money out of. So the idea behind the artificial limestone method is, let's turn the CO2 into something useful. And it's a good thinking, because if you're taking out 40 gigatons of CO2 a year, which is what we'd have to do to match the rate at which we're adding CO2, then what do you do with 40 gigatons of CO2? What do we do with it? It's a bigger quantity of stuff than anything else that man produces on the planet. So let's use it for something where 40 gigatons of material is needed. And that's road building, house building, everything involving concrete, everything involving roads so the method is intended to make it an emission-free method of producing concrete, as opposed to a really wasteful method that produces a lot of emissions, and an emission-free way of building roads. It's a good idea. My own view is that they won't get enough money for their product to pay for the cost of doing it. So there will have to be some taxation there, and the question will be whether America can tolerate that taxation or not. But I think it's a great idea. I've visited the company that does this, seen them at work, and I really think they've got the technology working, and all it needs is for somebody to give them a lot more money, and they can go ahead and make a real difference, I think.
Right. Well, considering we spent the last 20 years here in the United States at war with Afghanistan and Iraq and things like that, I mean, they should be able to find the money somewhere if they just stop fighting long enough to fund some of these things that could actually save the Earth.
Right on, Jennifer. Well, that segues into a question, Peter. Political will and governments, and given the gravity of the predicament we're in, other than the last ditch efforts, what do you think how do you think governments should respond? I mean, if you had a perfect world or a perfect government, what would you like to see?
Well, I would like to see them accept that this is the most important threat of all in the world, and this must be given top priority. So they shouldn't give top priority to building some more aircraft carriers and getting some more vertical takeoff fighters. You should be taking global climate change to be the threat, because it threatens the very things that you are trying to defend anyway. Like if you are Trump and you're spending a huge amount of money on building new aircraft carriers and vertical takeoff fighters, then the threat that climate change holds is that the world will become uninhabitable. So there's not a lot of point in defending American interests with more aircraft carriers when there's no viable world left for people to live in. So people have to realize that, and in theory they do, but in practice they don't. I mean, in theory, everybody says, yes, if we don't do X, Y, and Z, the world will be finished. But in practice, it's always easier to not do X, Y, and Z, because the world isn't finished this week or next month. And so long as the end of the world is deferred by and doesn't happen instantly, it's not a nuclear war or something, then governments prefer to do nothing. And it's a fault, a basic fault in human nature. And I don't know what can be done about it. I mean, it does indicate that maybe as a species we're unfit to continue running this planet, because we're incapable of seeing and recognizing the real threats to our existence and doing something about them. So if we're not prepared to do anything about these really serious major threats, then we don't deserve to survive, and probably we won't. So I don't like to join the gloomy type people who say we're doomed, but unless we do really do things and do starting now, then we are doomed.
I don't think it's alarmist at all. I think it's realist. And unfortunately, the term climate realism has been hijacked at least in the United States, by the Heartland Institute, who employed their anti-Greta to spread the message that there's nothing to see here.
Yes. How's she getting on, by the way? I mean, has she vanished?
Well, I think she may have vanished a bit because she's not with the Heartland Institute anymore. But that was a concerted effort to confuse the young people. And in fact, obviously, Thomas, Galen, and Colleen are confused enough in that venue that they wrote the paper they did. And then we have the anti-Greta confusing things even more. It's a very tough call to see if we can have the political will, and that's not a doomer view. It's realism, but not in the realism of, oh, there's nothing happening. It's very well for these people to put on the blinders and say nothing's happening, but yet they won't put on a mask to take care of a pandemic.
Yeah. Well, Greta, I mean, I think the value of Greta, I'm just talking today to Stuart Scott, who was the person who introduced Greta to the world. So he's did a marvelous job for humanity there, and unfortunately he's very ill. But Greta had that ability to cut through the kind of this jargon crap from politicians about, well, we must be realistic about climate and do things systematically and do them slowly and so on. And she just says, well, if we don't do everything now immediately, we're doomed. We've had it. We've got to do it now. And speaking as a young person, so it's absolutely incredibly valuable what she's saying. And she has to keep saying it, of course. But it may be that can get something going, because I think young people are much keener, with certain exceptions, like the ones that we've been discussing. Young people are keener to see real action about climate change than older people are, because older people just, in a way, want to live out their lives in relative peace. Like I'd like to live out my life in relative peace.
I concur.
They're going to be less keen to take radical action than young people, because young people have got longer lives ahead of them. So the sort of rallying call that Greta gives out is very, very important, and I think it's marvelous that she exists.
So do we.
Absolutely. Do you think, the paper that Thomas Nicholas, Galen Hall, and Colleen Schmidt, the faulty science, doomism, and flawed conclusions of deep adaptation, do you think that one of the reasons they took exception to the math and just basically said, oh, the exponentiation's not there, it's not that bad, these guys are all alarmists, do you think that they were motivated a lot by the fact that they were young, or what do you think there? Why did they take that stand?
No, that's weird, because I mean, I teach a lot of young people. I mean, I'm teaching in Italy this year at 2 different universities, and I've got lots and lots of young, very, very keen, enthusiastic people who very often also are saying, why wasn't I taught any of this before? And so you're sort of teaching courses that have been newly created by the university because they didn't have courses on climate change. So young people are very, very keen and very, very enthusiastic to get something done. So in a way, what's weird about these 3 is that they're sort of old before their time. I mean, the arguments they're putting out are the sort of tired old arguments that climate change deniers used to put out. So they've obviously not gone to look at the science as it's understood now. They've simply looked up some years old stuff put out by climate deniers. So it's a kind of slightly bizarre thing. I wouldn't like to say these 3 are typical of young climate people. They're in fact more typical of very old climate people.
Peter, there had been a comment on one of the videos that they Googled their way through the paper. I thought you might find that interesting.
Yeah. There's no. I mean, the ignorance there is quite extreme. So, well, I don't think one needs to say anymore. But
yeah, I think we can segue to actually emotional strength. and all of that you've seen and all of that you've experienced, where do you find your strength? Where do you find your strength to stay with the trouble and watching the ice world, which has been your whole life and love? Where is that strength coming from?
Well, there are a few foundations that are doing research in or trying to find funds for research in this field of taking out carbon dioxide and taking out methane, which I think is the only way forward for survival. And so it's worth helping and working with them in any way I can, because I think that is our only way forward. So I don't mind that the rest of everything is falling apart. Well, I do, but I can see that if we can get CO2 removal going successfully, we can save the world. If we can't save the world. So it's a pretty simple relationship, really. If you really believe that you want to try and help save the world, you should really work flat out with whoever will let you help them for finding and developing ways of CO2 removal and ways of methane removal, and put all your eggs in that basket, and that could save us. So it's not one shouldn't despair. There is a solution, but there is only one solution left. In the past, there were many solutions. In 30 years ago, we could have reduced our emissions. We could have done a lot of things that would have saved us from having to do drastic things now. But we failed to do anything. And now we've only got that one drastic thing left, which is CO2 removal. So we have to do it.
I think we covered it pretty well. Peter, do you feel complete, or would you like to talk about some other things?
No, I think I've said what I really wanted to say. And because the only further thing I'd say is, why aren't governments and major foundations putting much more money into carbon dioxide removal and methane removal? Because this shouldn't be some kind of experimental research that you do in the back room of some small lab somewhere. And all the labs I've visited of carbon dioxide removal, they're brilliant people, full of energy and working on shoestrings. So why aren't we getting much more support out of governments and foundations to do CO2 removal? That would be my plea, to do that, and that would save us.
Yeah, and that gives you the impetus to go on to keep your inspiration, is that there is a solution that you're working on. Can you tell us again the name of the organization you're working with?
Well, there's one, the one that I think is doing the most at the moment is the Climate Restoration Foundation, which was founded by a Bay Area businessman called Peter Fikowski a few years ago. And of course, he lives in the Bay Area right beside all these companies, like the company that does the limestone. There's several companies like that, and they're all living around him. So when I went to visit him, he just took me around to visit all the companies that are doing CO2 removal. So a hotbed of CO2 removal is the Bay Area. So they should be, somebody should be pouring funds into the startup and small companies in the Bay Area. And the other companies that are doing that, there's a company in Canada, and this Climeworks, which is a company based in Iceland. And weirdly enough, here in Italy, there's a little branch of it, which I'm trying to get involved with. So the few companies that are really putting their support into this are the ones where foundations should be supporting them. So the foundation, like the Climate Restoration Foundation, which is doing really good work, is trying to get the foundations that have money, the ones like the Gates Foundation, to put that money into demonstrated projects that work for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's where these foundations can do very good work, and I think they need all the support they can get.
And that's where the political will of the future should lie then. That is where activists should be putting some of their time, and lobbyists, at least in the United States. Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Jennifer?
Well, I think this has been a really very interesting interview, and we've been taking, deep dive into a lot of ideas. And what I see is that humanity at large somehow has to make this evolutionary leap, because the technology is there to take the CO2 out. Can humanity collectively make the mental and emotional evolutionary leap to put their spirit and mettle behind these initiatives? And can it translate to government? Can we save ourselves, or are we just too stupid to survive? That's kind of my readout on it.
Peter, we could do this again and go on. This is fabulous. I thank you so much for joining us at Environmental Coffee House, Peter. Any last words you'd like to say to us and our audience?
No, it's just been a pleasure, and now I have to rush on to another phone call, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
Well, Peter, it's been a true pleasure. I hope that we can talk to you again in the future. And until then, we'll just stay tuned and watch the Arctic melt.
Okay. Right. Well, I hope this does some good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Pleasure.